All right, so I think we're gonna go ahead, now that Barb's on and everything, we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So last week, of course, you'll notice that we are not starting a new chapter this week like we have gotten into our lovely pattern of doing. We're right smack in the middle of a chapter, and of course, I do the good thing of reminding you that when Luke wrote this, he did not have verse breaks and chapter breaks and all that kind of thing. It was just one big long thing. I hate calling it a thing, but the lacking of proper wording is the culprit there. But so the fact that the heading Paul speaks to the people, where we're starting tonight, starts in the last few verses of chapter 21, and then all of this keeps going through chapter 22. That's why I did not want to just go straight from 21 to 22, because I didn't want to interrupt that. Because the last verse of chapter 21 leads right into Paul's speech that starts right at chapter 22, and I thought that's not a great.
No, it says saying and then a colon, and I'm going, duh.
Right, exactly. It's like, yeah, it's not a good place to stop.
Who wrote that?
So I know, it's the wonder of our English translations and all that of the Bible. So yep, so then we will be starting off with verse 37, but before we get to that, kind of got a review question for you guys. Can you remember, or you can look back if doesn't come to your memory, what is it that Paul has been accused of that has landed him before the tribune, that has landed him in the situation he is currently in?
Oh, talking, including the Gentiles versus excluding them? I don't know.
So you're on the right page about the Gentiles.
Okay.
It has something to do with where he's at and where, who they found with him and what he is in this particular town for.
Oh, here he's arrested. Okay.
Well, the Gentiles weren't supposed to be in the temple.
Right, yep. Barb's got it. So yeah, he is accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple. And so that's kind of what has landed Paul into this situation. All right, so now going into chapter 21, verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." So already the tribune is pretty surprised by Paul, because you figure the tribune, this guy, Lysias, who remember is his name, he is either so what is he surprised about? He is very surprised to hear that Paul can speak Greek at all. Either that's the thing, or that he is able, or that there's a particular form of Greek there, but mostly just the fact that he's surprised that he can speak Greek at all, because he gave Paul one look and he didn't think that Paul was able to speak any type of Greek. And notice that who Lysias brings up here, he suspects Paul to be the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. This is in reference to an Egyptian man. I have not been able to find his name, but he was able to convince people, this was a few years prior to all these events, that he was a prophet, saying that the walls of Jerusalem would fall due to his presence. But then the Romans were able to come in and squash that revolt, but the Egyptian ran away.
Hmm.
So that is who Lysias assumes Paul to be. And Paul is here saying, that is not who I am. I am a Jew. I am from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. And then he really wants to speak to the people. Because that is something Paul does whenever he's in tight situations, is he wants to speak to people. Alright, so then we continue on with verse 40. And when he, the tribune, had given Paul permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. When they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. So pause for just a second, how the fact that they are mad at Paul and they want to be rid of him, and yet they're still willing to listen to what he has to say.
Yeah.
I can't help but find that impressive.
Mhm.
Plus the fact that he is addressing them in this Hebrew language. They're surprised to not be hearing Greek coming out of his mouth, because that's the common language of the empire and the surrounding areas in that day.
Yeah.
And so, and he is addressing his fellow Jews, plus the leaders. You notice he's saying brothers and fathers. So he's addressing the Jewish leaders as well. And this is the first of 5 defenses that Paul makes in the book of Acts.
Hmm.
So then Paul continued on saying, verse 3, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia. So information we just heard him give to Lysias, he's now giving to these people. But brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. So you notice what Paul is detailing here for the Jewish people is his life, what he was as a Jew, and his history, the fact that he brings this up in multiple places, in Acts and also in the letters that he writes, just how pious of a Jew, how high up there he was as a Jew. So he was born in Tarsus, but he was brought up in Jerusalem, brought in the city Jerusalem, educated at the feet. So this answers the second question I've got here. Which individual does he mention that we have met before in Acts? That's Gamaliel. I'm saying it like 50 different ways, and I don't know which is correct. But if you remember all the way back in Acts chapter, I did not do the good thing of listing it out so I could easily access it. Chapter
5.
Thank you. Chapter 5. When the apostles are arrested, we have Gamaliel there. It was interesting. I noted in my commentary, it was either in the commentary or the Lutheran Study Bible, saying that they said it's possible that it was the same person. I don't see how it could not be the same person. I'm very much of the assumption that the Gamaliel that Paul is talking about, his teacher, is the same one that's listed here in Acts chapter 5. The one who defends the apostles and basically tells the rulers in the temple, like, hey, if this is a thing from man, this is going to die out quick. But if this is from God, you're not going to be able to squash this. In fact, you should not squash this if this is from God.
Mhm.
Yeah, so like I said, I found that interesting when they said that that whole thing of, this is very likely the same. I'm like, why wouldn't it be the same person? I've always been under that assumption that it was, in fact, the same person between the one who taught Paul and the one later talked about in Acts chapter 5. But yeah, so nevertheless, Gamaliel is the individual listed here. And Paul is very much going on saying of how he thought he was on the right path. He was going on this path of bringing all of these Christians persecuted this way. We've talked about this before, how followers of Christ were known as the way before they were actually known as Christians. And saying how the same leaders who are now wanting him to be eliminated, from them, he got all these letters to have these Christians arrested and have punishment brought on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as we know, that all changed, as he is going to be describing here. Verse 6. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. So, of course, the important event that Paul is describing in his own words here is his conversion on the road to Damascus. And notice how he describes it, how he relates this account. It is not word for word verbatim, similar to how Luke actually wrote it in Acts chapter 9.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one difference we can point out, verse 10, Paul says, he asked the question, What shall I do, Lord? You go back in Acts chapter 9 to that portion about Saul on the road. Nowhere is it listed of Paul asking this question. Now, that's not to say that Paul is lying or anything of that nature. It's just pointing out the differences that are there. It's very well possible Luke just did not include that for various reasons.
Okay.
Yeah, so like I said, the differences I'm talking about here are not bad, just the pointing out that there are differences that are here.
Yep.
Yeah, and so then this is one of these accounts that is very straightforward, and there's not a whole lot you can do with kind of dissecting bits and pieces here like you can with various other like speeches and all of that. It's Paul basically just relating to the crowd of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, you can see the differences that are there, but other than that, and of course, notice how Paul is quick to use his Hebrew name of Saul. Obviously, that was how he was known back then. The fact that he still uses that.
And plus, when you relate a story, you fill in other things and forget other things or don't bother with it. So, yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if it's actually a saying, but the whole thing of you really can't tell the same story twice.
Right.
You can tell the same story 2 different times, but it's 2 different times. You're not going to be able to try and explain it and describe it in the exact same way. Exactly. Yeah. Then verse 12. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour, I received my sight and saw him. And he said, The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name. So there are other details in here that are added in. We'll talk about that in just a second. But notice how Paul is describing Ananias here. Obviously, Ananias is going to be someone well known to the Jews still in Jerusalem. As he describes, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. So they're going to the Jews in Jerusalem are probably going to know of Ananias rather well. And so this is to assure Paul's audience that Ananias was directed by the one true God. It's to let Paul's audience know that Ananias was directed by the one true God. That it wasn't anyone acting of their own accord or anything like that. It was all come together being directed by God.
Mm-hmm.
And notice here the extra stuff that Paul quotes Ananias of saying here. One thing that I think can describe all this that Ananias is saying here that he's not quoted of saying in Acts chapter 9 is simply for the fact that Luke probably did not feel he needed to add all that because he recorded the vision that Ananias had received earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So we got Ananias hearing this about Paul, because notice what Ananias is telling Paul, that the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. If you go back in chapter 9 of Acts, we're going to be doing a lot of flipping here. But go in chapter 9 to where Jesus is speaking with Ananias. If you want to look at it, look at verse 15. Yeah, he says, because Jesus says, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings of the children of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, so we already got this information of what Paul is going to be doing. Jesus is telling Ananias what Paul is going to be doing. So we don't need to hear all of this again. It's a narrative thing. If you describe a certain action, everything in a story, you don't really want to have a character quote the whole thing again much later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what's going on, and that's why Luke did not record all of that in there. Whereas now, Luke is writing all of this with Paul quoting Ananias. And you could probably argue and say, well, we read this in chapter 9, why do we see this again? But keep in mind, this is Paul talking to the people, so this is very important that you hear this. Did any of that make sense? Or was I just rambling and going all over the place?
You did good.
Okay. Yeah. So then, looking at verse 17. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, They themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So this is another thing that Luke does not mention directly in Acts, but Paul talks about quite a bit. And that is Jesus actually appearing to Paul. So that is the event being described here in greater detail, is Jesus appearing in this trance, this vision, to Paul while Paul is in the temple. And and pretty much agreed on that this happens 3 years after his conversion. So this is not an immediate response to Paul's conversion, but this is 3 years after the fact.
Okay.
Yep. And so then Jesus is basically telling Paul to get out of there, get out of Jerusalem, because people are not going to accept, as he says, they're not going to accept your testimony about me. They're not going to accept what Paul has to say. Of course, this comes off the back burner of what has already happened to the other apostles in Jerusalem, as we have talked about in the previous chapters in Acts, notably in chapter 12. And it's interesting then what Paul says, what he responds to Jesus with. He says, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another, I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. So he's saying here, hey, these people are going to recognize me as that guy who dragged them off to be killed.
You're gonna remember.
Right, they're going to remember it. I mean, we talked about when we talked about through chapter 9, how the people in Damascus were wary about Saul and Paul, because of what he did, because of why he was originally there before his conversion. And then in verse 20, he says, when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. So Paul, not only is he worried about people remembering, well, he knows that they're going to remember for him for what he did, but now he is seemingly showing guilt for his participation in Stephen's stoning.
Yeah.
We're basically seeing the guilt that Paul has for this. At least that's what what Luke is describing here, what Paul is saying to the people here. He's showing his guilt for the participation. As you remember, right at the end of chapter 7, if you will recall, when Stephen is being stoned, mentions about Saul being there and basically making sure that this gets carried out, that this stoning gets carried out. Now, Paul relates to the crowd how he is we assume the way he is talking here, he's showing this guilt for his participation in that. But of course, he is assured by Christ that he is on the right path of where he needs to go. That notice how Jesus says nothing else to Paul other than go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Saying, yes, this happened, but you are on this path. You are now on this path for me, and you will spread my name to the Gentiles. Basically what Jesus is saying here. All right. Any questions or comments about all of that, of what Paul said to the people? Like I said, a very straightforward passage here. That's literally, it's just Paul relating his life and relating of how he became the Christian that he was. So then You would think that him outlining all this is going to go well. Does anything ever go well for Paul whenever he says he makes a speech, whatever?
Always has a challenge.
Yep, there's always a challenge. And verse 22, we get what happens. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." So notice Luke says, up to this word. What word do you think it is that stirs the crowd up all over again?
Gentiles.
Yep, exactly.
Uh,
They basically remember why it is that they have Paul up there in the first place. And Gentiles is, pardon my using this phrase, but that trigger word that gets the crowd all riled up again. And verse 23, they are ready, and as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging, to find out why they were shouting against him like this. So they're not only just stirring up violence and going crazy, they're ready to stone Paul on the spot.
mhm.
That's what they're doing here with all this kicking up dust, flinging dust into the air, and throwing off their cloaks. They're ready to stone Paul on the spot. So then the tribune decides to bring him back in, and he has him examined by flogging. Because the tribune cannot for the life of him figure out why these people hate this man so much, why they are ready to just kill him. He can't understand why this is going on. And of course, doesn't look like things are going to go well. Then something happens very similar to what happened earlier when Paul was on a second missionary journey, and he's able to get himself out of this. Verse 25. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." Notice the card that Paul brings out again here. That basically saves his hide.
Get out of jail free.
Exactly, yeah. Basically is what it is. I mean, he's still going to be put in prison, but at least it gets him out of such severe punishment.
Yeah.
So he reminds them that, like, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You guys can't do this to me.
What surprises me is the fact that they just instantly believe him. I mean, in
Right.
today's world, boy, you've got to have papers and go through the courts and all this stuff.
Right. Well, the centurion reports this to the tribune, and we're gonna discuss here in just a second how the tribune is a little sketchy about this. So it's not right off the bat, oh, get away scot-free, but
Yeah.
yeah. So, so he's able to play the Roman citizen card again, and so verse 27, the tribune came and said to Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And Paul said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Basically saying, so how much did you pay for yours? Well, because he still is not completely, he does not understand who Paul is. He doesn't understand Paul's background. He doesn't understand why Paul is hated so much. And you can probably have reason to believe that he has doubts about Paul's, right, yeah, about his ancestry and because of his looks. The fact that he's able to speak Greek and yet he is a Jew and all this kind of stuff. So then Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So the Tribune, so lastly here, the Tribune doesn't see how a man like Paul can buy Roman citizenship until Paul tells him the truth. He thinks because of how Paul looks, he thinks Paul is just able to buy Roman citizenship just like Lysias did. But then Paul tells him the truth, like, no, I am a citizen by birth. I did not buy this. I had nothing to do with that. I am legitimately a Roman citizen. And everyone just backs off.
It's
They
not
just completely back off.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yep, and basically the Tribune is scared now. Rightfully so, because if anyone from Rome gets word of what he was about to do and the fact that he had bound him for seemingly no reason, that's not going to look good for him. Just like what happened in Philippi. All right, so any questions or comments about all that we studied tonight? Like I said, it's a passage that, unlike some of the others we've looked at, is pretty straightforward. Not a lot of deep thinking involved, if you want to put it that way.
I noticed though that this time he didn't mention that there were like scales on his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
That it was just the bright light that he couldn't see. Because
Right.
of the light he couldn't see.
Yeah. I think that has to do more with the fact that Paul has more of a focus on kind of more of, if you want to put it more of the theological perspective, that's kind of where more of his focus is. Whereas Luke, being our narrator and also being a physician, he's able to kind of.
Doctor, he had to have the reason for the blindness. Where Paul, it was just the Lord that, filled him with the light and he couldn't see.
Right. Yeah, and also the fact that Paul was describing all of these details about his life and how he got from where he was to where he was back under Gamaliel and all that, to where he was at this point now.
Yep.
That's kind of more of Paul's focus. He's not bothering to stop at the little nitty gritty details.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good.
So, say that again?
30 next week.
Yep, so right smack in the about 3/4 of the way through of a chapter, then we'll run through chapter 23 again. So,
Okay.
good deal. All right, well, thank you both so much for joining me tonight, and
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. Bye. Have a
And
good-
apologies for being late.
no worries.
John doing okay? Improving?
Can't say that he is, but at least it's not being stuck in the hospital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Poor guy. All right. Well, you take care over this weekend. Stay cool.
We'll try.
Yeah. All right. God's
We'll
blessings
try.
to you both.
All right. Talk to you
Thanks a
later.
lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.